Get to start out with a special ability. Declaration of Destruction. Let's go. Well, I like that. That's quite stylish. Costume Quest 2. It's like they took Costume Quest and put a number 2 next to it. But does that number 2 actually mean anything? Well, I sat here and played all of Costume Quest in one Twitch stream, and, you know, my audience was enjoying the game so much they actually gifted me a copy to play the sequel the next day. And we sat there and we played it. We did kind of come to the conclusion that this game is basically a reduction of everything from the first game and is nowhere near as good. This was a sequel to the Double Fine RPG Costume Quest. Loved that game, which had some problems, but you know, in typical Double Fine fashion, it was quite good. Unlike their other game, Space-Based DF9, which was an unfinished train wreck that they still allow you to buy at full price, because that's not morally reprehensible at all. At least fix your stuff or something. Seriously, I have not forgotten about this, and I'm going to bring it up every chance I get when talking about Double Fine. If you're going to play only one of the Costume Quest games, play the first one. It was a perfectly fine, self-contained adventure that was just fantastic. This one feels like it takes every problem the first game has and exacerbates it, and it's just nowhere near as good. Now, the story follows our heroes from the first game, so hopefully you know the plot to that, because they're not going to sit back and tell you what it is. And it starts in a weird dimensional wormhole thing. Look, I played the first game and I have no idea what this is on about. I can only assume this has to do with the first game's DLC, but I don't have access to that, so I couldn't tell you. But yeah, even if you played the first game, you might be entirely lost. Either way, you hop through a wormhole and look, you're back home! Except not quite. First of all, because there are characters that weren't introduced in the first game wandering around, such as this time wizard guy, and oh yeah, this dentist guy who's gonna be the main antagonist, don't worry about him at all. But more importantly, we learn that this cannot be where our characters are from, because we learn very quickly that this is some kind of parallel dimension where their house is next door to where their house was in the first game. And the only logical conclusion I could come to was that this was a parallel dimension, because other than that, it would mean that Double Fine couldn't be asked to load up their first game for 2 minutes to see where their characters lived. And that could never be, right? Once again, you either play as Ren or her brother, Boy Ren. Although you kind of play as both anyway, it's just whoever's leading the party this time around. Either way, it's Halloween again, even though we just got back from the previous game, maybe, which was also Halloween, so I guess they lost a year of their lives in some sort of time dimension limbo, and they decide to go out trick-or-treating. Whichever character you pick, it's gonna be Ren. They are equipped with a mighty superhero costume, and their sibling Boy Ren is once again trapped in his crappy, terrible candy corn costume. Except this time, candy corn has value in the plot. Sorta. While trick-or-treating, an evil dentist has somehow become friends with some sort of time wizard and has sent you kids back to the past so that you can't destroy his plans to ruin the future and make it some sort of dentistry, authoritarian, fascist utopia. So you kids have to figure out how to control time to go to the future, learn that your previous two teammates were actually, like, together in a relationship and quite happy, except you never build inter-party relationships, damn it, because, you know, if our two party members from the previous game are together, that means, like, Ren and Boy Ren have to be together, and I don't want to think about that, Double Fine. I don't want to think about that. But either way, they're sent back to the past for the first chapter of the game, where they have to do some stuff, where they have to go trick-or-treating and then find their way to the future, where they're gonna be for, like, the next 5 hours, and it's very, 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 very monotonous and dull at that point. The story to this game is effectively a reduction to the original game. While the cute writing is still here, and there's definitely a few laughs to be had here and there, there's a lot less conflict going on in the story. Like, the only real conflict you have is with the final boss. And the only sort of building sort of friction your party ever has is with one late game party member that doesn't get brought up until the final boss, and then just kind of gets hand-waved away anyway. It feels a lot less interesting than the previous game where the two siblings actually had some friction together, and ultimately it affected the plot and dragged the story out. Here it's just, well, we have to have some like late game conflict come up, so let's just sort of write it in a way that kind of makes sense, but it doesn't feel earned and it doesn't feel rewarding or interesting. And at no point did I actually feel like this conflict was actually going to build to anything, and yeah, it didn't. Likewise, as I said, you spend the majority of the game in the future. If the first game could be defined as a game with 3 chapters carried over 4 hours, and we define a chapter as a new location with, well, effectively the same events to happen because these are very repetitive games, then this game can be defined as a game with 2 chapters, and you're done the first chapter within the first hour. The remaining chunk of game you're spent in the same boring dystopian cyberpunk future, and that's interesting for like the first hour or so. And then you realize this is just sort of the whole game at this point. It never goes anywhere beyond this. And like, yeah, okay, you can go to a like individual compound in this dystopian future, and you could maybe make the case that's a different chapter, but it's still aesthetically the same area, and it's just very dull because you've already spent the first 4 hours of the game stuck in this place, you know? It doesn't ever evolve in terms of environments, and if you're building a game on a time travel plot, which, side note, don't ever build a time travel plot in your story. It doesn't work. I'm saying this from personal experience. If you're really gonna do it, go ham and actually like use all sorts of crazy different environments, or at least build an extra chapter where you go trick-or-treating with dinosaurs or something. But spending the first hour in the past in the bayou, that was kind of neat. Going to the future for the first hour was neat. Then spending the next 4 hours in that future was really, really unbelievably mind-numbingly boring. So yeah, the story, the environment, everything just feels like a reduction from the previous game. And the previous game, you know, it felt like it was going along for what it was, but at least it felt that by the time you got to the end. Here it hits you halfway through. Now granted, I'm somewhat biased because I played this back-to-back with the first game, and they're very similar, albeit this one has less interesting, less varied stuff to do in it, but it feels just stretched out and far more repetitious, and that repetition will hit you far faster than the first game ever thought to. You're pretty much just trick-or-treating everywhere, going to every house just like the first game, except there's less stuff to get in between that because, you know, fascist authoritarian future, I guess no one wants to bob for apples, even though the bobbing for apple guy said he specifically did it for the dentistry industry, so I don't know. Inconsistency! The gameplay to Costume Quest 2 is basically that of the original, but again, everything is drawn out and slower. If you're not familiar, it's an RPG that also features some very, very light PC adventure gaming puzzles. Although it feels like the game is far more focused on the RPG aspects this time than the adventure game nonsense. It's still there, but certainly a lot less. Outside of combat, your main goal is to visit every single house and trick-or-treat there, where you will play a game of Am I Getting Candy or Monsters? They have cranked up the amount of monsters you run into here. In the previous game, it felt kind of 50-50. Here it feels closer like 80-20. You're gonna run into monsters. And that means you have to fight, which is slow, and once you get through every single house, you'll be able to get past the arbitrary roadblocks that allow you to progress through the chapter. Sometimes you have to interact with some other NPCs to allow the progression of story, but that's pretty much it. Unlike the previous game, there are substantially fewer mini-games to be had. In the previous game, there was stuff like bobbing for apples, which was repetitious, but it was at least something to break up the rest of the game. In this game, the only minigame that survived the culling of all the extra content is find 6 random kids to upgrade your candy bucket, which is not really all that hard. You just have to talk to everyone, and that's it. It's very, very dull. It doesn't add any extra gameplay. Again, it's just talking to everyone and drawing everything out a little bit more, which does not benefit this game in any meaningful way. The only real thing about adventuring that feels like improvement over the first game is that every costume now has wheelie shoes. In the previous game, that was relegated to a single costume, the robot, which is not in this game unless you have pre-order DLC because, yup, they added 3 of the classic costumes from the previous game as pre-order DLC that we don't get to have. But it does mean that people can run around on the environment faster, which is nice, even though none of the costumes utilize wheels. So it's a little weird, but, you know, it's a quality of life thing that I appreciate. Fortunately, though, the costumes once again retain the ability to utilize some sort of function to help exploration and puzzle solve, which is nice because it does break up the flow of wandering around trick-or-treating a little bit and advancing the plot. Once you actually get into combat, it is mostly the same. Some of it's better, some of it's worse, but most of it's largely unchanged. Effectively, your character will transform into whatever they are dressed as a real version of that, kind of as a sort of kaiju battle against whatever monster you are fighting. For some reason, in combat, each character is controlled with a separate button. The only reason I can think that they did this was to make defending your characters a little bit more complicated, because you have to figure out which character is being targeted and then quick time event their button. but it doesn't really add anything to the game that the original version already didn't have. Attacking likewise invokes a quick time event that requires you to time your character's button prompt, but again, the first game probably did this better with every character picking more or less a random button to time or button mash. It was still very one note because most of them just involved timing that one button, but at the very least, it randomized it so it kept you on your toes. Here it's just a matter of press the thing corresponding to your one character and you're good. Every turn you will be storing up energy that can be then used as a super attack, and for one of the few upgrades this game has over the original, that energy persists. So if you want to start a fight later on using a character's super, you can hold on to that. And that varies up the gameplay a little bit. You can hold on to that as a strategic ace in the hole, so to speak. Likewise, as another plus to this game, the individual costumes feel like they have slightly more varied combat roles, whereas the first game, they were pretty much primarily all attacking, aside from like 2. This one, it feels like the combat roles are a little bit more varied up, and that's definitely appreciated. It's nice to try different costumes and see how they synergize a little bit more. It's not much really, but compared to the first game, it is one of the few upgrades. However, here's where the combat gets worse. For one thing, they removed battle stamps, and battle stamps were the closest thing to equipment you had in the first game. This is effectively a passive buff. One of the few ways you could actually customize your characters. I actually genuinely quite missed the battle stamps because that was something to vary up the gameplay a little bit. Whereas in this game, they are completely absent. In fact, one of the characters, the character who sold you the battle stamps in the first game, even points this out. Now, on the bright side, they did bring back the Garbage Pail Kids, and they do have a value in this game in the fact that they are actual functional items in combat. You can equip yourself with a deck of any 3 cards you've unlocked, and they are reusable. However, they have a recharge timer of a certain number of fights before you can actually use them again. Because of this, I kind of always felt disincentivized to actually use these, because what if I get to a fight where I really need my cards? I don't want them to be on a recharge timer. And by the end, I think I used them twice, and once was on the final boss. That said, I do appreciate that they at least included these cards and made them have some value other than just an arbitrary collectible like the first game. That is quite good, but making you wait multiple fights for them to recharge really just made me not want to use them at all, for fear of really needing them and having to wait on that timer. The way this is set up is just not very good. Maybe have each one only usable once per fight or something. That would be a little bit better, but having to wait multiple fights in between not only makes me not want to use these, if I do use them, it means I kind of have to grind a couple of fights just to get that back, which isn't fun, and that just makes the game even more stretched out. Likewise, it's a small thing, but one thing that really bothered me, and you might not be able to see it because my face cam's in the way, sorry, but in this game, they actually tweaked the GUI from the first, and it's less helpful here. In the first game, it would actually tell you what enemy you were fighting, as well as what level they were. And this helped you make an informed decision about how you want to prioritize enemies. Do you want to go after the higher level enemy because he's stronger, or do you want to take out the popcorn so that there's less enemies attacking you by the end? That's a choice you had to make on your own. In this one, they removed that information entirely. You have no idea what level each enemy is. The only information you really have to go on is how much health they have, which, yeah, you can kind of infer exactly what everything is in relativity to each other based on how much health they have, but it's not a precise measurement. It doesn't give you exactly half as much information to make an informed decision. This is objectively worse. One other big change I noticed is in the first game, you got to heal for free after every battle. It was kind of nice because it meant you didn't have to worry about healing yourself in between fights. That's gone now. And if you want to heal, you have to find a designated healing fountain somewhere in the world. It might not be that far away, but it just takes so much time away from what you're doing if you want to get healed for fear of getting into another fight unprepared. It's just another thing that makes this game feel longer and more drawn out than it needs to be. Also, they've made enemies have like specific elements this time around, which I never really got used to that. Like, honestly, I couldn't tell you which element was stronger to which element. I just kind of ignored it. But on the bright side, each costume does have a bit more of a combat role. Each one has its own element to take advantage of that if you can wrap your head around the elemental system, which, to be fair, is not that complicated, but I did not pay attention to the individual elemental symbols or anything to actually follow that. And if nothing else, candy corn has a purpose in combat, and that's not nothing. That's actually quite cool. Candy corn also has a very useful ability in the final boss that's available nowhere else. And spoilers for the next little while, go to whatever time I put up here if you want to skip this, because I am going to rant about the final boss because it is badly designed. So the final boss is a 3-phase boss. With the first 2 phases, he has 2 minions. They are basically identical and not worth noting. The final phase, however, is just incredibly dumb. Effectively, the boss has a 1-turn charge attack that will hit your entire team, and I was going in low level, I assume, but every time I got hit by that, it took about half my health. This is the only move he has, and as far as I could tell, there was only one way to interrupt it, and that was using the special charge ability of the Candy Corn, a charge ability that did not exist outside of this fight, and a charge ability you had to wait several turns to use again. So a boss that is actively spamming an entire team targeting attack that can take half your health every other turn, and you have very limited ways of healing, that is just an obnoxiously made boss. Like, that is not fun. Up to that fight, the fights were more or less identical to the first game. Yeah, there were 1 or 2 new races of enemies, but a lot of the characters felt like repurposed assets from the first game, except now with some cyborg parts stapled on. But for the most part, there were still only like 4 different types of enemies that all did basically the same thing. A melee guy, black mage that buffs, a white mage that heals, and a bomb guy that goes across like 4 or 5 different races. They've added a few more, which is nice. So there is a bit more variance in the enemies, but they don't feel like they've really gone out of their way to make combat feel all that more interesting or strategic. And in a lot of respects, they've actually taken strategy away by limiting what information you have to work with. Effectively, the combat is very similar to the first game, and yet somehow worse in a lot of regards. It does feel like they actually made some efforts to improve what they did here, but some of the changes just make no sense. And I guess if I were to summarize my feelings on this game, it goes back to that one thing I said at the start about how they more or less couldn't seem to keep consistent which house the protagonist lived in. Like, that is the perfect analogy for the quality of this game. Let's copy and paste stuff we did in the first game, but let's not actually take the time to actually improve anything. We'll just make it kind of more the same, but worse. And that's what this game is, and that really annoys me because Costume Quest 1 was a decent enough game. It needed a few improvements here and there, but that was it. Whereas here, the combat's worse, there's less varied things to do, and everything feels like it's slower and more drawn out for no real benefit to the game itself. That is what this is. It's a game that did not have the effort put in to fix the problems of the first game, and they're still here and worse, while reusing so much to, I don't know, cut costs and make a product on the cheap or something, without any real regard to the end result as an experience. The overall presentation to Costume Quest 2 is really quite good. It has pretty much all the DNA from the first game in its visuals, which was also excellent. Even though the enemies are pretty much ripped from the first game, but with some cybernetics added to make them look a little future-y, I guess. The individual costumes, when they're on their characters, look like small, goofy pieces of costumes that the kids had to sort of make themselves, and that's what they were, and that's actually quite cool. When you actually get into a fight, you turn into a big, giant, realistic kaiju version of whatever you were, and that's awesome. And there's a lot of nice little details in regards to this. For example, if you pick the superhero outfit, depending on if your character being a boy or a girl wearing that, you'll actually get a different superhero model, which is really quite cool. As well, you can individually upgrade each costume once, and if you do, they will visually change a little, and that's quite cool. Although I will say that the overall pool of costumes this time around doesn't quite do as much for me. I liked the Thomas Jefferson costume a lot more than I thought I would, and it's kind of funny there's a Teen Wolf costume, but for the most part I just don't think the costumes are half as memorable as they were in the first game. As well, while the different environments do look very, very cool, you do spend the latter like 80% of the game in the same dystopian future, and that makes the last most of the game pretty one note in terms of visuals. There are some neat little details here as well because it is a dentist utopia. Like, giant barricades are made out of braces, and like some of the buildings are made out of teeth and stuff. That said, if you do have like a fear of teeth and other like mouth related things, that might bother you. But it did have some neat little aesthetic touches that fit the theme. I kind of appreciate that. Audio wise, the soundtrack is decent, although kind of unremarkable from where I'm sitting. It just wasn't all that great. Overall, the presentation to Costume Quest 2 is absolutely fine. It could be substantially better, but it could be substantially worse as well. And at least it played to some of the strengths of the first game's assets, so that's really cool. Now, if you want a copy of Costume Quest 2 on Steam, it is going for $17, which feels a tad high if I'm being honest. Like, you could get the original for like $10, which, again, that was a better, more succinct, self-contained adventure. This one just feels like a downgrade to the first game in a lot of regards, stretched out over a longer period of time. And it's annoying for me to say that because, like I said at the start, you know, this started because I was enjoying Costume Quest and so were my viewers on Twitch. You know, we were enjoying this and we wanted to keep the party going, so let's play the second one. Big shout out and thanks to KizuOrama for hooking me up with a copy, but it's just not as good as the first game. It seems like it almost actively acknowledges every single problem the first game had and then just said, let's make it do that again, except longer and worse. Because outside of a couple of tweaks to combat, like carrying your power over between fights, there are small bits of improvements here and there, but it feels like a largely reused version of the first game, but worse in most regards, with less interesting, less varied stuff to do in it. And that's a huge shame because Costume Quest was a genuinely quite good game. Had some issues, but, you know, a proper sequel could have fixed a lot of that. And instead, this feels mostly just like, let's recycle all our assets and do a half-assed job at giving us the same thing again. It's not a bad game, but I would just recommend the first game over this because it did it, but better and more succinctly, so you're not sitting around forever getting it done. But on the bright side, it's still nowhere near as bad as Space Base DF9, which every single opportunity I talk about a Double Fine game, I'm going to point out, they released an unfinished game, never bothered finishing it, overwhelmingly negative on Steam. Yup, Double Fine is not bulletproof. They made a terrible thing, and everyone needs to be reminded of this. Candy corn is not your monkey. Uh-oh. Candy corn doesn't like his chances. Defeated? Oh, come on. Candy corn could have countered his way through that.